Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Storytime with Uncle Monkey. I am your Uncle Monkey, and today's story is called The Fair One with the Golden Locks. There once was a most beautiful and amiable princess who was called the Fair One with Locks of Gold. For her hair shone brighter than gold and flowed in curls down to her feet. Her head was always encircled by a wreath of beautiful flowers and pearls and diamonds. A handsome, rich young prince, whose territories joined to hers, was deeply in love with the reports he heard of her, and sent to demand her in marriage. The ambassador sent with proposals was most sumptuously attired, and surrounded by lackeys on beautiful horses, as well as charged with every kind of compliment from the anxious prince, who hoped he would bring the princess back with him. But whether it was that she was not that day in a good humor, or that she did not like the speeches made by the ambassador, I don't know. But she returned thanks to his master for the honor he intended her, and said she had no inclination to marry. When the ambassador arrived at the king's chief city, where he was expected with great impatience, the people were extremely afflicted to see him return without the fair one with the locks of gold. And the king wept like a child. There was a youth at court whose beauty outshone the sun, the gracefulness of whose person was not to be equaled, and for his gracefulness and wit he was called Avenant. The king loved him, and indeed everybody except the envious. Avenant, being one day in company with some persons, inconsiderately said, "If the king had sent me to the fair one with the locks of gold, I dare say I could have prevailed on her to return with me." These enviers of Avenant's prosperity immediately ran open-mouthed to the king, saying, Sir, what does your majesty think Avenant says? He boasts that if you had sent him to the fair one with golden hair, he could have brought her back with him, which shows he is so vain as to think himself handsomer than your majesty, and that her love for him would have been made her to follow him wherever he went. This put the king into a violent rage. "What? Does this youngster make a jest at my misfortune and pretend to set himself above me? Go and put him immediately into my great tower, and there let him starve to death." The king's guards went and seized Avenant, who thought no more of what he had said, and dragged him to prison and used him in the most cruel manner. One day, when he was almost quite spent, he said to himself, fetching a deep sigh, "Wherein can I have offended the king? He is not a more faithful subject than myself, nor have I ever done anything to displease him." The king happened at that time to pass by the tower, and stopped to hear him, notwithstanding the persuasions of those that were with him. "Hold your peace," replied the king, "and let me hear him out." Which having done, and being greatly moved by his sufferings, he opened the door of the tower, and called Avenant by his name. Upon which Avenant came forth in a sad condition, and throwing himself at the king's feet, "What have I done, sir, that your majesty should use me thus severely?" "Thou hast ridiculed me and my ambassador," replied the king, "and hast said that if I had sent thee to the fair one with locks of gold, thou couldst have brought her with thee." "It is true, sir, for I would have so thoroughly convinced her of your transcending qualities that it should have not been in her power to have denied me, and this surely I said in the name of your majesty." The king found, in reality, he had done no injury, so he took him away with him, repenting heartily of the wrong he had done him. After having given him an excellent supper, the king sent for him to his cabinet. "Avenant, I still love Avenant, I still love the fair one with locks of gold. I have a mind to send thee to her, to try whether thou canst succeed." Avenant replied that he was ready to obey his majesty in all things, and would depart the very next morning. "Hold! I will first provide thee with a most sumptuous equipage." "There is no necessity for that," I need only a good horse and your letters of credence." Upon this the king embraced him, being overjoyed to see him so soon so ready. It was upon a Monday morning that he took leave of the king and his friends. Being on his journey by break of day, and entering into a spacious meadow, a fine thought came into his head. Avenant alighted immediately, and seated himself by the bank of a little stream that watered one side of the meadow, and wrote the sentiment down in his pocket book. After he had done writing, he looked about him every way, being charmed with the beauties of the place, and suddenly perceived a large gilded carp, which stirred a little, and that was all it could do, for having attempted to catch some flies, it leaped far out of the water, as to throw itself upon the grass, where it was almost dead, not being able to recover its natural element. Avenant took pity on the poor creature. He took it up and gently put it again into the river, where the carp, feeling the refreshing coolness of the water, began to rejoice, and sunk to the bottom. But soon rising up again, brisk and gay, to the side of the river, "Avenant, I thank you for the kindness you have done me. Had it not been for you, I would have died. But you have saved my life, and I will reward you." After this short compliment, the carp darted itself to the bottom of the water, leaving Avenant not a little surprised at its wit and great civility. Another day, as he was pursuing his journey, he saw a crow in great distress. Being pursued by a huge eagle, he took his bow, which always he carried abroad with him, and aiming at the eagle, let fly an arrow, which pierced him through the body, so that he fell down dead. Which the crow seeing, came in an ecstasy of joy, and perched upon a tree. "Avenant, you have been extremely generous to succor me, but I am a poor wretched crow. I am not ungrateful, and will do you a good turn." Avenant admired the wit of the crow, and, continuing his journey, he entered into a wood so early one morning that he could scarcely see his way, where he heard an owl crying out like an owl in despair. So, looking about everywhere, he at length came to a place where certain fowlers had spread their nets in the night time to catch little birds. "What a pity 'tis," said he, "men are only made to torment one another, or else to persecute poor animals who have never done them any harm." So saying, he drew his knife, cut the cords, and set the owl at liberty, who, before he took wing, said, "Avenant, the fowlers are coming. I should have been taken, and must have died without your assistance. I have a grateful heart, and will remember it." These were the three most remarkable adventures that befell Avenant on his journey. And when he arrived at the end of it, he washed himself, combed and powdered his hair, and put on a suit of cloth of gold, which having done, he put a rich embroidered scarf about his neck, with a small basket wherein was a little dog, which he was very fond of. And Avenant was so amiable, and did everything with so good a grace, that when he presented himself to the guards at the palace, they paid him great respect, and every one strove who should first give notice to the fair one with locks of gold, that Avenant, the neighboring king's ambassador, demanded audience. The princess, on hearing the name of Avenant, said, "It has a pleasing sound, and I dare say he is agreeable and pleases everybody." She said to her maids of honor, "Go, fetch me a rich embroidered gown of blue satin, dress my hair, and bring me my wreaths of fresh flowers. Let me have my high shoes and my fan, and let my audience chamber and throne be clean and richly adorned. For I would have him everywhere with truth say that I am really the fair one with locks of gold." After which she ascended her throne of gold, ivory, and ebony. She also commanded her maids of honor to take their instruments and play to their own singing so sweetly that none should be disgusted. Avenant was conducted into the chamber of audience, where he stood so transported with admiration that, as he afterwards said, he had scarcely the power to open his lips. At length, however, he took courage and made his speech wonderfully well, wherein he prayed the princess not let him be so unfortunate as to return without her.
Gentle Avenant, all the reasons you have laid before me are very good, and I assure you I would rather favor you than any other. But you must know, about a month since I went to take the air by my side of the river with my maids of honor, and as I was pulling off a glove, I pulled a ring from my finger, which by accident fell into the river. Woe is me! How much I am afflicted by the loss of it! And I have made a vow never to hearken to any proposals of marriage unless an ambassador who makes them shall also bring that ring. This is the present which you have to make me. Otherwise you may talk your heart out for months and even years, shall never change my resolution.
When he returned to his lodgings, he went to bed supperless, and his little dog, who was called Cabriole, made a fasting night of it too, and went and lay down with his master, who did nothing all night but sigh and lament, saying, "How can I find a ring that fell into a great river a month ago? It would be folly to attempt it. The princess enjoined me this task merely because she knew it was impossible." He continued greatly afflicted in such a way, which Cabriole observing said,
My dear master, pray do not despair of your good fortune, for you are too good to be unhappy. Therefore, when it is day, let us go to the riverside.
Avenant took his little dog's advice, got up, dressed himself, and went down into the garden, and out of the garden he walked insensibly to the riverside, with his hat over his eyes, and his arms across, thinking of nothing but taking his leave, when all of a sudden he heard a voice call, "Avenant! Avenant!" Upon which he looked around him, but seeing nothing, he concluded it was an illusion, and was proceeding in his walk. But when he presently heard himself called again, "Who calls me?" he said. Immediately the carp appeared, and with an audible voice said, "Avenant, you saved my life in the meadow, where I must have died without your assistance. And now I am come to requite your kindness. Here, my dear Avenant, here is the ring the fair one with locks of gold dropped into the river." Upon which he stooped and took out of the carp's mouth, to whom he returned 1,000 thanks. The princess being told that Avenant desired another audience,
Alas,
said she,
the poor youth has come to take his leave of me. He has considered what I enjoined him as impossible, and is returning to his master.
But Avenant, being admitted, presented her the ring, saying, "Madam, behold, I have executed your command, and now I hope you'll receive my master for your royal consort." When she saw her ring, and that it was in no ways injured, she was so amazed that she could hardly believe her eyes.
Surely, contentious Avenant, you must have been favored by some fairy, for naturally this is impossible.
"Madam, I am acquainted with no fairy, but I was willing to obey your command."
Well then, seeing you have so good a will, you must do me another piece of service, without which I will never marry. There is a certain prince who lives not far from here, whose name is Galifron, and whom nothing would serve but that he must needs marry me. He declared his mind to me with the most terrible menaces, that if I denied him, he would enter my kingdom with fire and sword. He is a giant. He devours men as an ape eats chestnuts, and when he speaks aloud, he deafens the ears of those that stand near him. I answered him that I did not choose to marry, and desired him to excuse me. Nevertheless, he has not ceased to persecute me, and has put an infinite number of my subjects to the sword. Therefore, before all other things, you must fight him, and bring me his head."
At length he arrived at Galifron's castle, the roads all the way being strewed with bones and carcasses of men which the giant had devoured, or cut into pieces, or cut into pieces and then devoured, or then devoured and then cut into pieces. It was not long before Avenant saw the monster approach, and he immediately challenged him. But there was no occasion for this, for he lifted his iron mace and had certainly beat out the gentle Avenant's brains at the first blow, had not a crow at that instant perched upon the giant's head, and with his bill pecked out both the giant's eyes. The blood trickled down his face, whereat he grew desperate, and laid about him on every side with his mace. But Avenant took care to avoid the blows, and gave him many great wounds with his sword, which he pushed up to the very hilt, so that the giant fainted and fell down with loss of blood. Avenant immediately cut off his head, and while he was in an ecstasy of joy for his good success, the crow perched upon a tree, the very crow that Avenant had saved from the eagle, and it bowed deeply to Avenant. "I acknowledge your kindness, Mr. Crow," replied Avenant, "and I am still your debtor and your servant." So saying, he mounted his courser and rode away with the giant's horrid head. When he arrived at the city, everybody crowded after him, crying out, "Long live the valiant Avenant, who has slain the cruel monster!" But presently after, she saw Avenant enter with the giant's head, at the sight of which she trembled, though there was nothing to fear. "Madam, behold the head of your enemy, and now I hope you will no longer refuse the king my master."
"Alas,"
replied the fair one with locks of gold,
"I must still refuse him, unless you can find means to bring me some of the water of the gloomy cave. Not far from hence there is a very deep cave, about 6 leagues in compass, the entrance into which is guarded by 2 ferocious dragons. The dragons dart fire from their mouths and eyes, and when you have got into this cave, you will meet a very deep hole, into which you must go down, and you will find it full of toads, adders, and serpents. At the bottom of this hole there is a kind of cellar, through which runs the fountain of beauty and health. This is the water I must have, for its virtues are wondrous. For the fair, by washing in it, preserve their beauty. If they are young, it preserves them always youthful, and if old, it makes them young again."
"Madam, you are so beautiful that this water will be of no use to you. However, I will go in search of what you desire, though I am certain never to return." At length he arrived at the top of a mountain, where he sat down to rest himself, giving his horse Liberty to feed, and Cabriole to run after the flies. He knew that the gloomy cave was not far off, and looked about to see whether he could discover it. And at length he perceived a horrid rock as black as ink, whence issued a thick smoke, and immediately after he spied one of the dragons casting forth fire from its jaws and eyes, his skin all over yellow and green, with prodigious claws and a long tail rolled up into 100 folds. Avenant, with a resolution to die in the attempt, drew his sword, and with the phial which the fair one of locks of gold had given him to fill with water of beauty, he went towards the cave, saying to his little dog, "Cabriole, here's the end of me. I shall never be able to get this water. It is so well guarded by the dragons. Therefore, when I am dead, fill this phial with my blood, and carry it to my princess, that she may see what her severity has cost me. Then go to the king my master, and give him an account of my misfortunes." While he was saying this, he heard a voice call his name. "Who calls me?" said he, and presently he espied an owl in the hole of an old hollow tree, who, calling him again, said, "You rescued me from the fowler's net, and now the time is come. Give me your phial. I am acquainted with all the secret inlets into the gloomy cave, and will go fetch you the water of beauty." Avenant most gladly gave the phial, and the owl, entering without any impediment into the cave, filled it, and in less than a quarter of an hour returned it well stopped. Avenant was overjoyed at his good fortune, and gave the owl 1,000 thanks, and returned with a merry heart to the city. Being arrived at the palace once more, he presented the phial to the fair one with locks of gold, who had then nothing further to say. After which he set forward with him. The Fair One with Locks of Gold thought Avenant very amiable, and said to him sometimes upon the road,
"If you had been willing, I could have made you a king, and then we need not have left my kingdom."
But Avenant replied, "I would not have been guilty of such a piece of treachery to my master for all the kingdoms of the earth, though I must acknowledge your beauties are more resplendent than the sun." Eventually they arrived at the king's chief city, who, understanding that the Fair One with Locks of Gold was arrived, he went forth to meet her, and made her the richest presents in the world. The Nuptials were solemnized in such demonstrations of joy that nothing else was discoursed of. But the Fair One with Locks of Gold, who loved Avenant in her heart, was never pleased but when she was in his company, and would be always speaking in his praise.
"I had never come hither had it been not for Avenant, who, to serve me, has conquered impossibilities. You are infinitely obliged to him. He procured me the water of beauty and health, by which I shall never grow old or hideous."
The enviers of Avenant's happiness, who heard the queen's words, said to the king, "Were your majesty inclined to be jealous, you would have reason enough to be so, for the queen is desperately in love with Avenant." "Indeed," said the king, "I am sensible of the truth of what you tell me. Let him be put in the great tower with fetters upon his feet and hands." Avenant was immediately seized. When the Fair One with Locks of Gold was informed of his misfortunes, she threw herself at the king's feet, and in all tears besought him to release Avenant from prison. But the more she besought him, the more he was incensed, believing it was her affection towards Avenant that made her so zealous and suppliant on his behalf. Finding she could not prevail, she said no more to him, but grew very pensive and melancholy. The king took it into his head that she did not think him handsome enough, so he resolved to wash his face in the water of beauty, in the hopes that the queen would then conceive greater affection for him than she had. This water stood in a phial upon the table in the queen's chamber, where she had put it, that it might not be out of her sight. But one of the chambermaids was going to kill a spider with her besom, and by accident threw down the phial. Not knowing what to do, she bethought herself that she had seen a phial of clear water in the king's cabinet, very like what she had broken. Without any further ado, therefore, she went and fetched that phial, and set it upon the table in the place of the other. The water which was in the king's cabinet was a certain water he made use of to poison the great lords and princes of his court when they were convicted of crimes. Now the king one evening took this phial, and rubbed his face well with the water, after which he fell asleep and died. Cabriole was one of the first that came to the knowledge of this accident, and immediately ran to inform Avenant of it, who bid him to go to the Fair One with Locks of Gold, and remind her of the poor prisoner. Cabriole slipped away unperceived through the crowd, for there was great noise and hurry at the court upon the king's death, and getting to the queen said, "Madam, remember poor Avenant." She presently called to mind the afflictions he had suffered for her sake, and his fidelity. Without speaking a word, she went directly to the great tower, and took off the fetters from Avenant's feet and hands herself, after which, putting the crown upon his head, and the royal mantle about his shoulders,
"Amiable Avenant, I will make you sovereign prince, and take you for my consort."
Avenant threw himself at her feet, and in terms of the most passionate and respectful returned her thanks. Everybody was overjoyed to have him for their king. The Nuptials were the most splendid in the world, and the Fair One with Locks of Gold lived for a long time with her beloved Avenant, both happy and contented at the enjoyment of each other. The end.